Okay, let's now move on to objections to the prophecies in Daniel. Daniel chapter 9, verses 24 to 27. We will be told first that these verses have nothing to do with the Messiah. It's the first thing we'll be told. They have nothing to do with the Messiah. Then we'll be told Daniel 9:24 was not fulfilled by Jesus. Then we will also be told that Christian translations of Daniel 9:24 to 27 divide the 70 weeks incorrectly, and the dates have no relation to the times of Jesus. These are the primary objections to the book of Daniel, these major prophecies. And then finally, that Daniel 9:24 to 27 speaks of two anointed ones. So again, we get the context first. In Daniel, the 9th chapter, Daniel's in exile. He's been in exile close to 70 years. He knows that Jeremiah has prophesied that the Jewish people will be in exile in Babylon for 70 years. He's praying, God, isn't it the time now? Aren't we getting close to the time of restoration and release from captivity? Not from 586, when the major captivity came, but when Daniel was taken some years earlier. Aren't we getting close? And God speaks to him and basically says, there's something bigger. There's something bigger than the return from exile. There's something bigger than these 70 years. It's actually a period of 77s, 70 weeks of years. In other words, not 70 years, but 490 years. And during this time, momentous things will happen. So this is big. This is bigger than the return from exile, Daniel. This is a special revelation that is being given to you. And with this revelation, I'm explaining things of critical importance in the life and history of the nation. Now, there are some Christian translations that say, make reference to Messiah with a capital M, or even the Messiah in this passage in Daniel 9:24 to 27. I would say that's definitely a mistranslation. First, the word the does not occur before Mashiach in some of these passages. So to say the Messiah, wrong and misleading. So I agree with that critique. Shouldn't be. Also, even to translate with Messiah, with capital M there, could be misleading. Oh, is it Messianic prophecy? Ultimately, yes. Is it possible there are two anointed ones? Could be. Say, well, I don't get the connection between the anointed one and Messiah. Remember, Mashiach in Hebrew is an anointed one. And then the Mashiach, the anointed one, is the Messiah. But Mashiach in and of itself just means anointed one. So when Christian translations say anointed one or the anointed one or anointed one with a capital A, capital O, that could be potentially reading something into the text. I don't mind that as much as I mind putting Messiah there, because that could be misleading, even though the text ultimately speaks of the work of Messiah. Daniel was speaking of an anointed one, or we'll see, two anointed ones. We'll look at that. And then we find out what one of these anointed ones does, and it is to bring our redemption by dying for the sins of the world before the second temple was destroyed. So, wrong objection that the text has nothing to do with the Messiah. Right objection that our English translation should not render with the Messiah. So let's look at the text here, and I am going to read it to you from the English Standard Version, just because it's what I have in front of me, and we'll then comment on Jewish translations and different understandings. But since it's often the Christian translations that are being critiqued, I'll read a Christian translation. 70 weeks, 77s, are decreed about your people and your holy city to finish the transgression, to put an end to sin, and to atone for iniquity, to bring an everlasting righteousness, to seal both vision and prophet, and to anoint the most holy place, or holy thing, or holy one. Those are options given in the footnotes. Know therefore and understand that from the going out of the word to restore and rebuild Jerusalem to the coming of an anointed one, a prince, there shall be 7 weeks. Actually, the text says to restore and build, not rebuild Jerusalem. There shall be 7 weeks. Stop. Then for 62 weeks it shall be built again with squares and moat, but in a troubled time. Stop. And after the 62 weeks, an anointed one shall be cut off and shall have nothing. And the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, Its end shall come with a flood, and to the end there shall be war and desolation so decreed, and he shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week, and for half of the week he shall put an end to sacrifice and offering, and on the wing of abomination shall come one who makes desolate until the decreed end is poured out on the desolator. Well, the further we get into the passage, the more difficult it seems to be. But this much is clear. Something of tremendous and momentous importance is going to happen over this 490-year period. Are there gaps in it? How do we divide the weeks? Or the stops, the way I read the translations, is that in keeping with what the Hebrew says, or the Masoretic accentuation? Is it a misreading there? We'll cover all those things. We'll cover all those things. When does it start? When does it end? We'll cover all that. Well, here's what's clear. And here's my recommendation in dealing with this passage, major on the majors. There is a period of 490 years within which these 6 things must happen. And they are of such importance that they overshadow Daniel's prayer for the rebuilding of Jerusalem and the rebuilding of the temple and the restoration of the exiles. In other words, yeah, that's going to happen, but there's something that's going to happen once it's rebuilt in Daniel. That's what I want to talk to you about. So let's notice this again. From the going out of the word to restore and build Jerusalem to the coming of an anointed one, a prince, there should be 7 weeks. So it could be from this starting point, the Latin term used, nice little Latin term, terminus a quo, the time from which. This part to this part, is that going to be 49 years and there's an anointed one and this one's involved with rebuilding the temple and so on? And who is that anointed one? Well, fair questions. And then is that followed by a period then of 434 years, the 62 weeks? And then after that, there's another anointed one. It seems to be 2 separate anointed ones. Could well be. But what then happens, these 6 things that are spoken of must come to pass. There's even debate about some of the translation of these. Finish the transgression, put an end to sin, atone for iniquity, bring in everlasting righteousness, seal both vision and prophet, and anoint a most holy place. Am I saying this is Messianic primarily because it says Mashiach? No. I'm saying it's Messianic primarily because of the momentous nature of what must happen before the second temple was destroyed. Now, there are some critical scholars that don't believe in predictive prophecy and don't believe that Daniel was written by or about a character who lived 500-600 years before the time of Yeshua. They believe it was someone who lived in the 2nd century, so maybe 150 years before the time of Yeshua, or a little longer than that. And it was written about events taking place in his day with the Maccabees and the restoring of the temple and the battle with Antiochus Epiphanes and so on. The problem is there's nothing that momentous that happens. That, yeah, the temple's rededicated and the Greek power is broken and there is a time of Jewish freedom for that season. But how can you say it finished transgression and put an end to sin? Or atoned for iniquity, brought in everlasting righteousness. You really can't. You really can't. Now, we'll deal with the counter-missionary objections to this shortly. But let's just say first that to just apply it to things that may have happened in the days of the Maccabees doesn't work. So what actually happened and what was the great importance of this prophecy? Well, you say if we could just find out when this began, going forth of the word to restore and build Jerusalem. You know, there's great debate about that. Some say that's the decree of Cyrus, which took place shortly after this, the decree of Cyrus to rebuild the temple. The problem is if you have the 490 years consecutively, that winds you up well before the time of Yeshua and well before these final momentous things happen with the destruction of the temple. Others say, well, it's when Daniel spoke this word. This was it, or when Gabriel spoke it to Daniel. We don't have the exact date on that, but again, it's hard to line up. Others would say, yeah, but there was a decree of Artaxerxes. It was like 445 BC. And if you look at a prophetic year, like a prophetic year is 360 days versus 365 days, and we can prove that. And if you'll do that and then compute from 445, it gets you right up to the time of the crucifixion of Yeshua. That's quite amazing. And yeah, look at every detail. And wow, that's quite amazing. The problem is it's a bit of an obscure decree to say that was the decree to start it, and then the 360 days, the prophetic calendar, and so on. It's somewhat debatable. So what do I do with this? I look at what we know. that at some point in time this begins, and we have a definite end point, a terminus ad quem, a time until which we have a definite final point, and the definite final point ends with this. Jerusalem is destroyed, the temple's destroyed, a Roman prince, Roman leader sacks the city and brings desolation. So before that happens, before the second temple was destroyed, all these things need to unfold and come to pass. What's the traditional Jewish interpretation of this? Could you explain, say, Rashi, foremost Jewish commentator, what does he have to say on this? It's brilliant, incredible insight into the text. Well, A.J. Rosenberg, permanent translator of Rashi, explains Rashi's comments as follows. 70 weeks of years have been decreed. Rashi explains on Jerusalem from the day of first destruction in the days of Zedekiah until it will be destroyed the second time, to terminate the transgression and to end sin, so that Israel should receive their complete retribution in the exile of Titus and his subjugation, in order that their transgression should terminate, their sins should end, and their iniquity should be expiated, in order to bring upon them eternal righteousness and to anoint upon them the Holy of Holies, the ark, the altars, and the holy vessels which they will bring to them through the King Messiah. The number of 7 weeks is 490 years. The Babylonian exile was 70 years, and the second temple stood for 420 years. Now, the 420-year period, that's according to rabbinic chronology. It actually stood for closer to 600 years. But hang on. Did you follow this and have a slight problem with Rashi's explanation? The problem is, what's the destruction by the Romans and then the exile under Titus, and where does that bring us to King Messiah? Rashi's day, that was roughly 1,000 years later, Messiah hadn't come. Today, 2,000 years later, Messiah hadn't come according to traditional Judaism. How do we go? It's kind of a bit of a jump, isn't it? So Rashi's comments that this prophecy involves a time of restoration brought about through the King Messiah tells us, yeah, there are messianic overtones here, but the Messianic Jewish interpretation places it back in the days of Yeshua, whereas Rashi's interpretation just basically appends it without any explanation. Now let's look at Daniel 9:26. And after those weeks, the Anointed One will be cut off, speaking of Agrippa, the king of Judea, who was ruling at the time of the destruction. He'll be slain. So the Anointed One who's going to be cut off is not Yeshua, but Agrippa, the king who was ruling at the time of the destruction of the temple. And he will be no more. Hebrew ve'ein lo, and he will not have. The meaning is that he will not be. The Anointed One, Hebrew Mashiach, this is purely an expression of a prince and a dignitary. And the people of the coming monarch will destroy the monarch who will come upon them. That is Titus and his armies. And his end will come about by inundation. And his end will be damnation and destruction, for he will inundate the power of his kingdom through the Messiah, and until the end of the wars of Gog, the city will exist, cut off into desolation, a destruction of desolation. So Rashi is placing everything here in the destruction that took place at the time of the Second Temple under the Romans, which we agree on, but I can tell you how all these things happened and were fulfilled before the Second Temple was destroyed, and how everlasting righteousness was brought in and iniquity was atoned for through what the Messiah did, whereas a brilliant commentator like Rashi does not really explain how this ties in with the Messiah and how all these things are accomplished with the destruction of the Second Temple. And if somehow it brought in everlasting righteousness for the Jewish people through the suffering under Titus, how come we've still been suffering since then? So there are some real challenges here. Jewish historian Heinrich Guggenheimer translates the power of his reign, that is Titus, will be blown away by the Messiah. Now, let's take a look at something earlier. Daniel chapter 2. Daniel chapter 2. There's a vision, a dream that Nebuchadnezzar has that Daniel interprets about these various kingdoms. And the various kingdoms begin with Babylon and then ultimately go down to Rome. But look at this. Look at this. Verse 44, in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. It shall break in pieces all these kingdoms and bring them to an end, and it shall stand forever. So in the days of these kings, what's the last of the kings? The Roman Empire. In the days of the Roman Empire, God is going to establish the kingdom of God, which will then ultimately spread and grow and destroy other kingdoms. What, pray tell, might that be? Might that be the kingdom that Yeshua announced, saying the rule of God, the reign of God, the kingdom of God is here? God has come to set the captives free. God has come to liberate. God has come to forgive. Something to think about, isn't it? So, here, Rashi, Daniel 9:27, and until destruction and extermination befall the dumb one, this is how Rosenberg translates the Hebrew there, and the ruling of the abomination will endure until the day that the destruction and extermination decreed upon it will befall it in the days of the King Messiah. So Rashi ultimately sees this as messianic, but the whole prophecy ends with the destruction of the second temple. So how is it messianic if the Messiah is not there for another 2,000 years? And how is it on the heels of that it's messianic if the Messiah doesn't come for at least 2,000 more years? Well, it makes sense. It is very, very, very simple. It makes simple sense when we recognize that the Messiah came before the second temple was destroyed, something that we established in the first series of lectures. So I'm not going to argue about, number one, when the decree started. That's up for debate. I will say that the 70 weeks end with the destruction of the second temple. Are there gaps? Is it possible that there are gaps, 7 weeks, 62 weeks, 1 week? Well, the text does not directly say it. It seems to indicate the possibility of a gap between the 69th and the 70th week, but I'll leave that open too. Put a question mark there. All I know is the final end point and what has to happen before it. That I'll be dogmatic about. Well, what about should we divide it into 7 weeks, stop, then 62 weeks, stop, then 1 week, as Jewish translations would read versus many Christian translations? In other words, many Christian translations would try to say, okay, you've got this period of 483 years in the Anointed One. So there's one Anointed One, the Messiah, Jesus, and then this final week. And Judaism would say, first you've got 49 years, then an Anointed One, then 434 years, then another Anointed One. I'm fine with that division. I'm fine with it. I'm fine with two Anointed Ones. One that's involved with the rebuilding of the temple, and then the one who's cut off, one who's killed. Now, I have no problem with that. Mashiach does not have to be used just exclusively for the Messiah. It can be used for the Messiah, but it's certainly not an exclusive term for Messiah in the Hebrew Scriptures. No, the general usage is it's not referring to the Messiah, but an anointed one. So I've got no problem with that. So the big issue is, okay, if we agree that this has to end, the terminus ad quem, the time up until which it has to end with the destruction of the second temple. If even Rashi sees this as ultimately leading to the days of King Messiah or having some messianic fulfillment. If Daniel 2 indicates that it's in the days of these kings, which culminates with the Roman Empire, after Babylon and the Medo-Persian Empire and Greeks and Romans, that the kingdom of God has to arise, starting something very small, arise and grow, beginning in the days of the Roman Empire, and these things have to be fulfilled before the second temple is destroyed, then the question is, did it happen or not? And if it happened, how did it happen? And does it involve Yeshua? That's what I want to major on.